Hey there, this is Michael Red from Leadership Zen. I am the author as well as the founder of Leadership Zen. And now that we've kind of put the whole introduction to Leadership Zen, which is a little bit more scripted and a lot less informal, which is kind of the way I like to talk to people, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the questions that I've received recently, which is about authenticity. So, for those of you that don't know, and I certainly encourage you to either visit the website at leadershipzen.org or to check out the book, The Six, on Amazon.com. Authenticity is what we call the foundational of the six commitments. So when we talk about Leadership Zen, we talk about the fact that it is very different than a lot of other personal development or leadership development programs in that we're not going to tell you how to do something, but we're going to ask you to commit to things that we've identified help people be more successful and more fulfilled. Authenticity is literally the foundational commitment of those six. And the reason why is because if you can't be true to yourself, the reality is you can't be true to anybody else, and nothing else that we can teach you matters. So what is authenticity? It kind of differs in terms of how you look at it. So some people will define authenticity as I'm real, I'm being real. And that's a pretty common comment, certainly in a social context. Say, I'm being real, I'm doing this. Authenticity is a more complex equation because it doesn't just involve how you feel about yourself and about whether or not you're being true, so to speak, to your own beliefs and your own things. But it also is about how other people receive you. And when I ask the question of myself and for others about whether or not you're authentic, the answer to me comes up with, or the real question comes up, is what do people say about you when you aren't there? So that's actually a classic leadership question, is one of those that's saying, how do people show up when you're not there? Or how do you show up when people aren't watching? It's a classic leadership question. But authenticity really is about what do other people say about you when you're not there? And authenticity isn't like a lot of other things where you can just simply say, I'm going to be more organized. And you can back that up with things. I will have a different calendaring system, or I will have different lists, or I will do this, or I'll establish routines in the morning. Which, by the way, I heavily like the idea of developing routines every day and every morning. But the fact is, authenticity, yes, it's a choice because you have to make a choice to live that way, but it's not a how-to because in order to get there, you have to change so much about how we normally do business in order to make it work. So what I'm trying to convey with respect to that is being authentic is as much emotional as it is mental. It is not a checklist. It is not a how-to, and it is not a checkbox. So let's kind of get to a place where we ask ourselves, how authentic are you? So I came up with roughly 5 bullet points. I think it's 5 bullet points that I use to kind of ask whether or not I'm being authentic in the moment, or certainly working with other people to find out whether or not you're authentic in the first place. The first one is, do you favor ego? So let's be honest. We all have an ego. It's part of that whole equation of the id, the ego, and the superego. But our ego does 2 things for us. Number one, it demands that we achieve. It demands that we do well in comparison to everything else going on in the world. But it also prevents us from identifying those things that are barriers within ourselves to be great. So the ego says, I did fine, but everything else around me did not. And that's what happens when we talk about not achieving the outcomes we want. I won't use the word failure because I don't like that word. when we don't achieve the outcomes that we want, the ego is usually at play in trying to find excuses to what goes on. Authenticity, by contrast, actually tries to find a reason why something didn't go the way you wanted it to, and therefore use your reason to solve for it. That's authenticity. Secondly, big question, are you open-minded? So we all have bias, we all have things that we grew up with, and we all have certain boxes with respect to how we perceive the world, and therefore how we interpret other people's interaction with our world. So we typically assume we come from a good place, and therefore if something doesn't work out, then it is because of other circumstances, or maybe we just didn't approach it right, whatever. But we assume that our intentions are correct because we know our intentions. But we judge other people based on their actions, and we assume their intentions, which is not a very good leadership principle, just laying that out there. Open-mindedness gives us this place where we can be free of judgment, where we can look at other perspectives, and we can actually, and this is the hard part, we can actually consider whether our own boxes are appropriate. That's hard because we all grow up with bias. But what we're trying to teach and what authenticity teaches is you have to be able to have a question about that to make sure that it's appropriate. Third, mindfulness. So we take a look at mindfulness. We take a look at how we operate. We got so many distractions in terms of technology and in terms of the people around us with different questions and so on and so forth, and quite frankly, just the white noise that goes on around us. So there's always a car going by, there's a siren, there's all kinds of things. I call that white noise because white noise is that stuff that exists around us but doesn't necessarily have to affect us, okay? It's not sitting in a meeting and having a cell phone open. Because with all due, most of us can multitask to the extent of being able to, get a little bit more productive. If there's a question being asked and whatnot, you get that answer now as opposed to 2 hours later. That's good. So there's a balance between that. It is, however, maybe not checking your Facebook while you're sitting back in that meeting or talking to your spouse or so on and so forth. It really is about being in the moment. For me, it's not a formal thing. For me, it has everything to do with recognizing that this world that we live in is an absolutely beautiful place. And I've said that before. And understanding and being a part of that world around you is significant when it comes to kind of that whole fulfillment thing and being able to, rather than think about whether or not the game's on tonight or whatever, look at 12 o'clock in the afternoon and say, what's going on around me? And being mindful about it is very important. That's authenticity. The fourth piece, do you treat people well? And this goes directly back to what I was talking about before, which is the whole notion of you feel this about you and what you bring to the table. But the other side of the question is, how do other people feel about what you bring to the table? I will tell you that when you are inauthentic, there's a trust issue on this side of the equation. People know when you're not being authentic. People know when you're being a fake person. The question is sometimes, do you know that you're being a fake person? Are you fitting into a persona instead of being a person when the people around you need you to be a person? That all comes down to whether you treat people well. Finally, it's about, are you true to yourself? Now, we'll talk in the future about whether or not the foundations that you have for yourself, whether you're curious enough, whether you are open enough, and we talked about that in point 2, whether you're curious and open enough to actually acknowledge the fact that maybe some of the beliefs that you have, the truths that you have, maybe aren't so true. And being able to look at things from other people's perspective. What I will tell you is that there are so few things in this world that are black and white, that good leaders look at the world in terms of gray. And if you're really looking at the world the right way, there's gray and then there's a whole bunch of colors around you, where you're taking a look at it not only in terms of developing a bunch of solutions, but also in recognizing that the importance of everything around you is tantamount to actually being fulfilled as a human being. Listening to music, listening to art, or watching art, or whatever. Very critical. So the question is, are you true to yourself? So the first one is, are you living up to your own beliefs? Then eventually the question is curiosity, are those beliefs good? But let's start with the internal compass. So Leadership Zen is a humanist philosophy that says our internal compasses should do two things. Number one, be true to yourself and recognize that you are the ultimate catalyst for change. But the second piece is also understanding that it's our duty and our ethical responsibility to do good for other people. If you can hold on to those, I'm going to be satisfied that you're at least on the right path. So the question, it's always the question that comes next is, how do I be more authentic? And I think that's a good question. It's a critical question. Again, I got 5 bullet points for this. They don't necessarily correlate with the last ones. But the first one is define your values. So ask yourself the question, who are you? And that's sort of a double-edged sword, because some of us are so ingrained with our biases, and we all have biases. We are so ingrained with our biases, we will not see any other perspective. That's not good. On the other hand, some people truly will work so hard to be a part of something that they lack an internal compass in the first place. Somewhere between those two is the right thing. So from my perspective, I think it's important to have beliefs. I think it's important to have your truths. I think it's also important that you challenge those from time to time to make sure that they're still relevant, or even that they made sense in the first place. And the way that we're born and the way that we grow is we're going to absorb some of these, and those are going to be ours when we're adults. On the flip side of that, though, is also making sure that at the end of the day, we are accepting of other people's places, we're accepting of other ideas, and we are accepting that moving forward or progress, which is important, because nobody wants to go back and reinvent the wheel, is understanding that is really making sure that we're being open to other perspectives and allowing that to evolve our own belief system. So we have bias. Bias doesn't have to remain indefinitely or forever. So changing that helps to make you that. Which ties really closely to number 2, which is be curious. So when we're kids, we look at the world and we ask a lot of questions, but we walk in without judgment. And people that can do that as adults, and it's harder as we enter adulthood, because we have these biases, we have these belief systems, and we have this foundational thing. But imagine being able to go back in your 20s or 30s or 50s or 70s or whatnot and be able to look at the world like you did as a child. And that's not a question of rose-colored glasses at all. What it's really a question of is saying that I will walk in with no judgment. That is being authentic. Number 3, trust your gut. Trust your instincts. The truth is, most of us make good decisions in the present. Where we get hung up is we either hold on to the regret of the past, or we're so worried about the future that we kind of handicap ourselves in the present. The fact is, the only time you have, and this goes back to that mindfulness question, the only time that we have is in the present, because you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. You have no idea what circumstances are going to affect what happens tomorrow. So it makes no sense whatsoever to do anything but trust your instinct. Now here's the reality. Instinct is based on your bias. Instinct is based on your belief system. And sometimes it's going to lead you in the wrong direction. But I go back to what Thomas Edison said. He said whatever his number was, whether it was 9,000, 10,000, or 1,000, when somebody asked him about the 10,000 failures that he had relative to inventing the light bulb, his answer was, I didn't fail at all. I realized that there were 9,999 ways to not do what I was trying to do. That's how we should approach the world. That fourth piece comes back to treating people with dignity and respect, and that means all people. So I never want to tell people that they have to like other people. I do spend a little bit of time teaching people that your biases and whatever don't necessarily affect how you should deal with other people. The fact is, none of us wants to be treated poorly. But a lot of us treat other people poorly, and we do so because we don't agree with their beliefs. There's a climate out there that says that with the anonymity of social media and this week's prevailing wisdom on how things are supposed to be, that it is better to attack than it is to debate or to have dialogue. Authenticity is about having dialogue, because I think that when you attack, that comes from a place of fear. And while fear is a 100% legitimate response to things that happen around you, we've got an organ in the back of our head, I think it's called the amygdala, that literally, it's probably not, but it gives you the fight or flight response. That's designed if a bear is attacking you. That is not designed because somebody says something that you don't like. Who cares? Treat everyone with a sense of dignity and respect, because that is no more than you expect for yourself. Give that. Finally, be aware of your own inauthenticity, because ultimately we all play personas. So if I go to work, I might have to play a role, and I might have to play several roles depending upon who I'm talking to. If we're at home with other people, whether it's your partner or spouse, your friends or whatever, the fact is we play a different role. Sometimes we call it compromise, which is generally good. Sometimes it's not so good because you're giving in and not being authentic to yourself. And that becomes a problem when we think about ourselves. So, we recognize that there's kind of three components: the work component, the social component, and then there's yourself. When you're not authentic to your own internal compass, that's a problem. So, how does all this come together? I think it comes together really in a word. And that word actually happens to be one of the commitments of Leadership Zen. And that's courage. It takes courage to be authentic. It takes courage to recognize, ultimately, that somebody's not going to like the persona that you bring to the table. What I'm telling you is that's okay. It takes courage to propose something that is outside of the conventional wisdom. I'm telling you that's okay. It takes courage to recognize that the things inside yourself, your own internal compass, isn't necessarily the compass that everybody else follows. That's okay. What's important is that you're making a decision in your own life and in your own being to say that more often than not, I am going to move and act according to some basic principles of humanism and human decency. Ultimately, this question mark of whether or not you can effectively treat other people, quite frankly, the right way. But what it really comes down to is identifying what you stand for and making sure that you're willing to live for that and to live according to that. And you're going to stumble. You're going to fall. I'm sorry. We all do. But if we recognize our own inauthenticity and we move on from that and say tomorrow can be a better day, that's how you begin to create the habits that we stand for. That's what the 6 commitments exist for. So what I'm asking you guys to do is to do that internal check to say, where do I stand on this equation? How am I doing relative to authenticity? The answers may surprise you if you're honest with yourself. The answers may surprise you. But fundamentally, it's all within our control. I'm just asking you to control it. So I want to thank you for being a part of this today. There will be more. And I always take questions as to whatever you want to talk to next. So thank you and welcome to Leadership Zen.